Test. Hi, Ray.
What's going on?
Hanging in there.
Oh yeah, me too.
Yep. You have some nice cans.
Here?
No, on your ears.
Oh yeah, thanks. I've had them for a while now. They're awesome.
I'm gonna try to share my screen. Okay. We've got a few people signed in. Okay, is everybody able to hear me and see my screen? Ray can hear me. Okay. There's a chat option, and if you want to, you're free to put questions in the chat. If you don't want to, try to like, interrupt or whatever, that might be easier to put questions in the chat as I'm going. All right, so this class format is so bizarre. I'm not used to this yet. I've done a couple lectures for my other class earlier on this week on Zoom, and so I know it's possible. I know that it's possible to do this, but it's very bizarre. So we've got looks like we've got 10 people in the class at the moment. All right. All right, so I guess I'll just start out checking in with the videos that I had made that I posted on YouTube. Are there any questions on any of that stuff? Anything that you wanted me to go over that maybe you think other people could benefit from here at all? And because that format, I don't have any way of knowing like how those things are received, so I can't look out into the class and see what's going on as you're watching the videos. But are there anything at all from those that you wanted to ask maybe as you were watching them? It's okay if not. I wanted to allow a chance to check in on that. Okay, so here's my plan for the next week or so. I want to actually I'm going to lecture. I don't know how much of an actual lecture this is going to be today, but I do have some thoughts on just framing the COVID-19 issue in a benefit cost framework. And so I wanted to go over that just a little bit. I have just some basic thoughts on how to think about it. I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of discussion about what the benefits and costs are. It's no one's really able to put any firm numbers on it, but I think a good start is just framing the problem. And so I want to spend some time today doing that. Part of that will be checking in and going off of some of your responses from the discussion that I had posted on Monday or Tuesday. But my plan actually, so I had a homework assignment number 3. So if you're looking at the syllabus, technically there's a homework coming up next week. I'm actually going to change the content of that completely. I'm going to make it just an assignment that relates to the COVID-19 situation. So it'll be, I haven't formally written it up yet, but my plan is to have the third homework assignment be kind of an outline that you're going to try to provide of how you would go about doing a benefit cost analysis of this situation that we're currently in. You can think about it broadly as having, like four different components. We have benefits, we have costs, and I'm gonna refer to these benefits and costs as referring to the benefits and costs of containment. So what are the benefits of enacting measures that make it less likely for the virus to spread? That's what I mean by containment. And so there's benefits to that, and there's also costs. We've already in the discussion, you guys have already thought a little bit about the costs of that. I want to make some comments today about the benefits of that. And then we have policies. So these are the options on the table for what to do about this containment. How strict should it be? What sorts of things should be done relative to other things that you would expect to be more effective? So what should be done about it? And then there's uncertainties. Obviously, there's uncertainties. So the overall idea of this this assignment will have something to do with just characterizing and discussing each of these 4 different elements, and these are all elements that are in your class projects, and so this will be a familiar sort of exercise to do. But I wanted to just not a super extensive one, maybe just a 2-page write-up of the different aspects of this problem, just because I know it's on everybody's mind, and I think it could be a really interesting and very relevant way of trying to apply some of what we've been learning in this class. So that's my plan for homework 3, is to make write up. This afternoon, I'm gonna finish writing that up, just the formal instructions for that. I'll post that, and I think I'm gonna try to make that I think I'll probably have that be due on Friday, April 3rd. So you'll have about a week to do that, and I'm planning to have at least one more in-class problem where I'll open up another discussion for you guys to write some of your thoughts and cite some sources for another aspect of this problem. I'm actually I'm planning on having we had for homework or for the problem set 8, we had a discussion of the costs of containment, and I think for problem set 9, I think I'm going to have a discussion of the uncertainties. So you're free to use any of the the content you've already written for those discussion pieces for this homework assignment, but it's just meant to try to get you to pull things together, sharpen your thinking, outline a framework for how to characterize the current situation in terms of benefits and costs and alternative policies and areas of uncertainty. So that's my plan for the next week, to discuss this a little bit. I don't know exactly how much of a discussion we're able to have here on this format. I haven't tried that yet. I haven't tried like having a discussion with the class in this online format. I've had just a couple straight up lectures in my other class, and there were some occasions where students would ask questions, and that was fine, but I don't know yet exactly how this new format's going to play for a class discussion. But nevertheless, we can we can do our best and try to see what happens. Okay, are there any questions about that that homework assignment or anything else, upcoming course logistics that you have questions about? Are there any questions about that? You're free to put questions in the chat if you want to. All right. Who was that who just came in the frame?
It's my older brother who is unemployed, so he's at home all the time.
I'm not unemployed. That's so.
Very good. Okay, we've met Ray's older brother. That's good. Okay. All right. So that's my plan for the next week. The next phase of the projects are the due date for that's coming up in a couple weeks. I believe it's 2 weeks from now. So I'm happy to continue to discuss issues related to that as they come up, either on Zoom or by email. Continue to stay in contact with me on that. Okay, very good. All right. So I drew up this graph here on this virtual whiteboard as a way to just think about what the benefits and costs of various policy actions are, and I think it's very important to just distinguish. In this case, distinguish between, the baseline scenario or the status quo, you might also think of this as business as usual. BAU is the abbreviation I'm going to use for business as usual. That's just the what would happen in the event that, let's say, you did nothing in response to the outbreak of this infectious disease. If you just allowed it to run its course, you didn't have any sort of policies or recommendations or guidelines or laws to try to shut things down and make quarantines a part of the new regime. Now, in the baseline, there's automatically going to be a certain degree of self quarantining. there's going to be some of that. So even in the event of no government policy or no government guidelines or recommendations or announcements or new executive orders, even in the absence of any sort of government policy, there's going to be some degree of people just reducing their economic activity as a result of the new infectious disease environment that we're in. And so you're going to have, you'd have people, even in the absence of government policy, you'd have some people, reducing work hours, and also you'd have people, staying home. Staying home from the store. They're not going to be going out shopping as often. They're not going to be consuming. So there's both, you can sort of think of this as being a supply effect and then a demand effect. There's going to be just natural responses from individual people as a result of having an infectious disease that's out and about. They're going to be just naturally wanting not to expose themselves to more of that if they don't have to. And so there's a certain degree of natural self-quarantining that would happen even in the absence of government policy. So that's what we're thinking about when we're talking about baseline is what's the natural response to an infectious disease outbreak. What's that going to be, even in the absence of any kind of government response. And that's going to involve, so this baseline is going to involve some combination of the baseline scenario it's going to involve some combination of illness and death, and reduced output or reduced economic activity. So that's going to happen in the baseline scenario, regardless of anything that's being done. And then the question is, how do we, if we're going to encourage perhaps more containment than would naturally happen? So from the perspective of an individual, there's the infection, there's the infection externality. So even if it's worth it to you to go out and shop or go out and work, even if it's worth it to you to do those things, the fact that there's costs that you're potentially imposing on other people, that's where you get maybe the combination of individual decisions not being optimal for society as a whole, where people who maybe themselves are willing to take the risk of getting sick, their behavior is inevitably going to increase the likelihood of other people getting sick. And so it's, by staying home, you're sort of blocking the transmission of the disease. So the disease doesn't have any path through you to get to other people. But if you put yourself out there, if you're continuing to go to work, you're continuing to go out in public and shop, you're allowing the disease to have a pathway through you toward other people. And that's where the externality part of this would come in, is the fact that it's other people potentially being affected, potentially a lot of other people being affected, because it would be you know, the people that that, you know, if here's you, you know, you come into contact with somebody, and then they come into contact with multiple other people, and you know, eventually, you know, each of these people is coming into contact with multiple people, of course, and so there's potentially a very large effect of you deciding to, you know, go out in public, rather than staying home. So that's where you might have a case where the optimal degree of quarantine or the optimal degree of containment would not be satisfied just by individual behavior. So then the question is, what can be done about that? So for this part, I have just kind of a framework for thinking about how to think about the benefits and costs of any individual policy. So on the x-axis, x-axis is going to represent some degree of containment that's taking place. So on the far right-hand side, we have BAU, which is just business as usual. That's no special policy to help contain the infectious disease spread. And then as you move to the left, relative to BAU, you're talking about having more containment. The bottom, the line, sort of the upward curve near the bottom of the graph, the one that starts at the origin and then increases and ends up roughly the one that ends here at this red dot. That's going to be a curve that I'm going to think about as being the cost of the illness itself, the cost of the loss, in essence, the lost value that occurs because of the outbreak. And that's going to be both the combination of the illness and the death, as well as the natural reduction in consumption and output that individuals are going to naturally do, just as a result of just some degree of self quarantining. So I'm going to represent those costs with this curve on the bottom. That's the lost value as a result of the outbreak. And so there's some level at this red dot, there's some level of lost value from the outbreak, just in a business as usual scenario. And then to think about the cost of containment, I think it makes the most sense to think about what the economy would be doing in the absence of any sort of intervention. So in the absence of any containment, in this business as usual scenario, the economy would be humming along, and you'd be achieving this level of, let me make that a different color. You'd be achieving, you know, a level of output that would be at this purple dot up on top of this graph. That'd be the level of economic output that would result in the absence of any kind of extra government push or policy to try to enhance containment. And then you can think about, and then that's your baseline of economic output, and then any extra containment you do is going to be inevitably reducing that amount of economic output. So more containment would involve sort of tracing a line down this curve, starting at the purple dot on top, and you're sort of tracing a path down this curve where you reduce your economic output. You have fewer people trading with one another. You have less businesses open. That's going to contract the economy, and so that's how to think about the costs of containment. Is what would the economic output be under the containment regime relative to what it would be without containment. All right. So then the benefits and costs of a particular policy, you already have this baseline scenario that has a given amount of self-quarantining and a given amount of illness and death. and that's going to be costly. You have some level of economic activity that would occur in a business as usual scenario. And then when you're thinking about a policy lever, when you're thinking about introducing some change in the system to try to influence social outcomes, then you would compare the change from that baseline to the new scenario. So here's how I think about the right way to measure these benefits and costs. So containment is something that is going to reduce the spread of the infectious disease, reduce illness and reduce death, reduce the pressure on hospitals in this time. And that's going to eventually result in some lower level of lost value due to the outbreak. So we can, if this red dot up at the top of this curve is the lost value due to the outbreak in a no policy scenario, this blue dot would be the lost value due to the outbreak, which would result from our response to the outbreak. So our containment policies maybe could allow us to go from say this red dot down to this blue dot. We would be able to reduce the cost of illness, reduce the number of people getting sick, reduce the number of deaths, reduce the pressure on the hospitals. And so the difference between the red and the blue, I'm going to say that that's the benefits of containment. The difference between the red and the blue, I'm going to characterize as the benefits of containment. So it's the change in the lost value of the disease in the baseline scenario relative to the new policy regime. So that's how to think about benefits to anything you might be doing. And then to think about costs, it's the same exact principle. You'd have some baseline level of economic activity. Again, that's given in this schematic diagram by this purple dot. And then maybe there's some alternative level of economic activity that results from having more containment. And so there's some teal. This teal dot represents the amount of economic activity in the new regime when you have implemented some strict containment policies. So the costs of containment then are the difference between the height of the purple dot and the height of the teal dot. That's what you're giving up. That's the economic activity that you're giving up as a result of putting strict containment measures in place and reducing the spread of the infectious disease. So that's how to think about these benefits and costs. I haven't specified an actual time frame here. You could think of this maybe as the value in a particular year, or you could think about it as a dynamic problem where it's representing the value over time as a result of these different measures. But with any policy, you'd essentially be trying to choose some position along this curve. So if you choose some level of containment at that point, then you have some costs, you have some benefits. You could also choose more containment, in which case you'd measure the change in benefits and costs at that yellow line. But that's essentially what the decision comes down to, is how far along this curve, how far along these curves do we go in terms of both the costs we're willing to incur relative to the benefits. So that's just a little bit of a framework for thinking about these benefits and costs. Are there any questions about Any questions about that before I move on to maybe some more specific things on the benefits and costs? Again, feel free to put questions in the chat if you want to. Oh, we got a question in chat. Yeah, okay, so this black curve, roughly speaking, I'm gonna use, this is gonna be economic activity. Ah. This black curve, which I'm tracing out again here, this black curve, that's the amount of economic activity that's going to occur under any particular level of containment. Let me just jot that down on another slide. So the top curve is the economic activity under any level of containment. So in the business as usual scenario, we have no extra lockdown policy in place. We have no extra recommendations or laws or executive orders to try to reduce the amount of trade or the amount of businesses that are open. And so the amount of economic activity that's going to result in a no policy case or a business as usual case is given by the purple dot. And then any sort of extra containment that we try to enforce, again, this is above and beyond what individuals would automatically be doing themselves to self-quarantine. But any additional containment that the government wants to impose and enforce on society, that's going to reduce economic activity below the business as usual amount. And so, for the given level of containment, say, the level of containment at this sort of hypothetical policy here, given by this yellow vertical line that's running down the x-axis, that's a particular level of containment, and there's a new level of economic activity that's going to be associated with that degree of containment, and so the difference between the level of economic activity in that containment regime relative to a business as usual is what I'm defining as the costs of containment. So it's the costs of containment are the vertical distance between the purple dot and the teal dot, because that's what you're giving up in a regime where you're enforcing stricter containment policies. Does that answer it for you? Is that what you were getting at with that question?
Yes, thank you.
Good. Okay. Okay. Anything else on this basic economic framework for thinking about the infectious disease and infectious disease response. Okay. So when you have, broadly speaking, whenever you have any sort of public health crisis like this, the policy levers that we're potentially trying to manipulate are things that we're hoping that will reduce the effective reproductive number of the disease. So a disease has a certain amount of ability to reproduce itself, or a virus has a particular ability to reproduce itself, given the characteristics of the illness that it produces, whether or not it produces a lot of sneezing and coughing, which can then send little droplets of water out into other people's faces or onto surfaces, which people then touch, and then they touch their face and it gets into their body. Different viruses are going to have different degrees to which they're naturally able to spread. And so the containment policies are going to be targeted at this thing called the effective reproductive number, which I'm going to use R subscript E to denote that number. So you can think about the policies of containment they're trying to reduce this RE, and that's what's going on as we're moving, say, to the from the right hand side to the left hand side of this graph. Those containment policies are going to be directed at finding a way to reduce this effective reproductive number. So the effective reproductive number depends on a number of different things. One is the duration of the infection, so how long people are infectious after they contract the disease. It's going to depend on the contact rate of the population, how often people are coming into contact with one another. Obviously, higher degrees of contact are going to accelerate the spread of the infectious disease. The number of susceptible individuals in the population, that's going to be something that influences how fast it's able to reproduce itself. There might be some cases where certain types of infectious diseases, some people already have a built-in immunity to them. Just genetically, they're not susceptible to that illness. And so that would, whatever sort of genetic characteristics of the population, those things could affect the number of individuals in the population that are susceptible in the first place to the disease. In the case of COVID-19, there's not really anything special that makes people immune to it automatically. Basically, everybody who hasn't already gotten sick is susceptible. So there's no real way to change that lever in terms of policy variables. But you can also some of these are directly affected by policy, and some of these are not. The last one, transmissibility. Yeah, transmissibility. For a given contact rate, that's the amount of that's the rate at which for a given contact, that's how many people infect other people, essentially. So these are the sort of the four parameters that affect how quickly something spreads. Now, there's only actually two of these that are within the control of policy. So the contact rate, that's something that we can manipulate through shutting down non-essential businesses and recommending that people stay home. Transmissibility, that's something that we can manipulate by having more hand sanitizer available, and encouraging social distance, even if you are coming into contact with somebody, just deciding you're not going to shake their hand or hug them. Those are things that are within the domain of policy. Whereas the duration of the infection, that's completely out of the control of anybody. That's just based on the characteristics of the virus itself. And then the number of susceptible individuals, that's not a policy lever that anyone has any control over. So containment measures are going to be things that target these two here. The number two and number 4 are going to be things that are within the domain of policy to manipulate. That's just, that's a little bit of just quick background on the way to think about the containment measures. Now, with costs of containment, you guys have already spent some time enumerating some of these and describing some of these. So I looked at your list. By the way, you guys did a really good job of hitting the big containment costs and prevention costs and describing them and doing a really good job of citing your sources. So I was really happy with the response on the discussion board from what I had posted on Monday. So that was really good. I'm going to try to just highlight what I think are the main bins, the main classes of costs that were mentioned on the discussion board. So I'm going to enumerate these. I'm going to enumerate them, and then you guys can let me know if I left anything out, and we can just make sure we hit all the important ones. So the first one, and maybe the biggest one, the most common one, was lost income. So there's people in retail, restaurants, hospitality, and travel industries that are affected by this quarantine, right? So I have a friend who works at a shoe store, and his business is closed now for 2 or 3 weeks. I have a friend who's a nail technician who's no longer able to work for the next couple weeks. So there's direct effects on these individuals who are not able to even if they're still technically on the payroll of the company, they may not be earning any wages during that time, and so that's a big cost to those individuals. And it's also a very diffuse cost. So the cost of the disease itself are very concentrated, and it's very easy to see, the number of deaths, for example. Those can be easily counted, and obviously that's a terrible tragedy for anyone who's knows someone who's died in as a result of this disease. And that's a very visceral, very tangible and concrete cost of the illness. This lost income, isn't as severe. It's not the same thing as being bedridden or knowing somebody who's died, but it's affecting a lot of people. Like it's having an enormous, widespread effect on the economy. The second main category that was brought up. I'm gonna put this on a new slide just so we have enough space, so I make sure I don't run out of space. There were several of you that mentioned effects on on supply chains. Right, so and these are sort of like long run, long run effects of the interruption that's happening. So the interruption is causing both costs to individual workers who are losing their income, but it's also going to be causing not just immediate costs from the interruption, but dynamic costs from what happens when you have supply chains that are interrupted, that are, you know, different production processes that are shut down for weeks or months. It takes a while to ramp those back up again, to reestablish supply chain relationships along the supply chain. You know, there's adjustment costs, you know, as people, you know, maybe they're not just losing income from a couple weeks of not having work, but maybe they are actually laid off, in which case they have to go find a new job. Adjustment costs for both workers who are having to adjust to their new scenario, being unemployed and having to figure out what kind of marketable skills they now have in the new economy to go out and try to sell themselves, sell their labor into the market, given the shock that's taken place. That's going to have, you know, some period of adjustment and transition. That's going to make it hard for people over maybe a longer period of time. It's going to take a while for, you know, businesses that have had to shut down for that, you know, for those storefronts and that capital and those buildings to get reallocated to something else that can use them productively. So those adjustment costs are part of the cost of containment. The interruption in the economy is going to produce things on that front. The third, I'm going to do a third. This is going to be actually just separate from the other two, but just the pure human effects of unemployment. You know, the fact that in some sense, you know, we're creatures that we're made to work. We really need to have some sort of way to channel our time and energy, and we derive a lot of meaning from our jobs. And so there's the human effects of unemployment, where you're not having as much satisfaction and sort of purpose in your life as a result of losing your job. And so, you know, you can have, even if you can't quantify these things, there's a lot of depression that could result from people just not having this sort of purposefulness that they used to have, which is a separate cost from just the lost wages. So I wanted to, that was brought up in the discussion board, and I think that's a distinct sort of cost. Another sort of something that's difficult to quantify, but this was brought up as well, is just the inequality. So the fact that you have knowledge workers who are able to work from home and experience very little interruption in their paychecks, and perhaps even very little interruption in their ability to function professionally in their work. And different social classes who aren't employed in those sorts of knowledge jobs are going to be hit disproportionately hard by these containment measures. And so that's going to produce perhaps a widening of inequality between those who are able to be flexible, use technology to maintain their working life in the face of this new regime, whereas other sorts of workers are not going to have the same opportunities. So again, that's not something I'm not quantifying that here. That's not something that we can really objectively quantify, but certainly it's something to be aware of, and it is, I think, a distinct cost apart from just the individual people that are affected in terms of wages. There was in the discussion there was a discussion of lost asset values, the amount of wealth that's been lost as a result of the recent 1 month 30% decline in the stock market since the beginning of March. So people close to retirement losing wealth. And this matters specifically for people that are close to retirement, because if you're young and you have some investments in the stock market, as long as you don't cash out right now, so if you just maintain your investments, the stock market is it has ups and downs, but it's pretty much been just going up 5, 6, 7% over the last 100 years or so. And so there's periods of time where you might take a hit, but if you're not planning to liquidate your assets, for another 30 or 40 years, you haven't actually lost any wealth because you weren't planning to sell those assets anyway. Whereas people that are close to retirement, that would be liquidating those assets now in order to prepare to retire. If the value of their assets falls just as they're about to retire, that is a direct hit to their wealth and their ability to maintain their well-being into retirement based on the money they've saved up and the investments that they've made over time. So that's a separate, that's a wealth-based cost. That's not a wages or salary-based cost. That's a wealth-based cost. And it's particularly hitting the elderly people that are on the verge of retirement. And then the sixth one, and we can see if there's any more, but just the cultural costs, right? So we have sports leagues that are shutting down. So somebody mentioned, there's no more March Madness. That's a huge cultural phenomenon that people derive a lot of pleasure from. There's not going to be an opportunity to fill out brackets this year, and of course, there's not a direct market for that. But it's something that people put a value on, internally, and like to see how their favorite team's going to be doing. They like the thrill of maybe putting some money down on their bracket. That's something that we're losing out on because of the shutdown measures or the containment measures, which are suspending these sorts of activities. So that's, personally, I was really excited to see how the Milwaukee Bucks were going to do. I'm from Wisconsin, and it wasn't. It hasn't been since like the late 90s, early 2000s where the Bucks have been any good. I remember when I was a kid watching the late 90s Milwaukee Bucks teams with Glenn Robinson and Ray Allen and Sam Cassell. And, the Bucks were at the top of the NBA this year in terms of record. And I was really interested to see how they were going to do in the playoffs, whether they had a chance to compete for a championship. And that's something that's been suspended, and I'm disappointed, personally for that. So these are other categories of costs that while not easy to quantify, they matter. They matter to people. They affect people, and anything that affects people is something that in economics ought to be accounted for in some way, whether it's quantitatively or even just qualitatively. Okay. I wanted to actually. But yeah, before I go on, did I leave anything out? I read over everybody's posts, but did I leave anything out? Anything that I forgot to mention that you had brought up in your post that you think is an important cost that I left out here? Ray, is this a question for me, or is this a question for your peers?
No, it's a question for you. I mean, these were all like our discussion posts were all from us. I'm curious of your opinion.
So what is you talking about yourself personally here, about what is your important cost to society?
No, like what do you think is the most important cost that like policy or whatever should sort out to society?
Like, you're asking about for me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. You said what do you think is my important? Okay.
Sorry, that's just 100% a typo. My bad.
Okay. I thought you were asking like what is Ray Hoy's important cost to society? Honestly, I think the number one is hard. Obviously, people are going to be losing 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 weeks worth of income. That's a pretty temporary measure. In my opinion, the biggest things are going to be these adjustment costs. I'd say number 2 is probably the most significant, because there's momentum that the economy builds up as business hums along, and so if that's interrupted, you can have an interruption of a couple weeks and not maybe see any long run effects. But if it occurs over 6, 7, 8 weeks, at that point it's not clear that you can just pick things up where you left off, and you might have a lot of you might have a change in the not just the immediate income, but the growth trajectory of the economy as a result of that interruption. The fact that you have sort of systems and organizations which haven't been used, over 2 months, and sort of the implicit knowledge that people have in just running the day-to-day operations, which maybe isn't necessarily written down anywhere, but people just sort of act out the knowledge just in the process of everyday business, and it's not obvious that sort of particular sort of implicit knowledge in people's heads, if that's going to be preserved over maybe a 2-month shutdown, if there's going to be some long run effects of actually changing the growth trajectory of the economy, as a result of that. So maybe if there's if there was one trajectory that, in the absence of the maybe if our previous trajectory was something like this, and in the absence of the pandemic, maybe the trajectory would follow that dotted line. But maybe in the case of this interruption, maybe there's some lower path that will persist out into the future. And so if if there's like long run effects like that, then you could have pretty significant gap between you know, the long run capacity of the economy relative to what it would have been in the absence of the interruption. So I think, at least in terms of monetary effects, that's probably the most significant in my mind, is this long run reduction in the potential growth path. Another, just quickly, one more thing that maybe isn't as quantifiable, which I think is really important, is this this unemployment effect. You know, if there are people that are, you know, that aren't just laid off temporarily, but have a really hard time adjusting and become long run unemployed, you know, then you have people that are depressed, maybe committing suicide, maybe getting addicted to drugs or things like that, and that's probably another one of, I think, the long run effects of this crisis that is not going to be directly quantifiable or visible, but certainly matters, you know, for human beings. Just sort of the human aspect of that problem. Okay, so yeah, Sienna asked a question about the response measures, like stimulus packages. So yeah, those are costs that essentially future members of society are going to have to pay. So we think about these are the costs of containment. If we think about mitigation, mitigation or relief. If the optimal government policy response involves some combination of aid packages to individuals, whether that looks like some kind of stimulus that cuts everybody a check for a few $1,000s just to help, you know, pay bills and give some support in the transition period. That policy would then, you know, that would reduce the effects of the lost wages of number one, the lost, that would sort of mitigate the effects of number one. You know, it could have some mitigating effect on the inequality. So inequality was number four. Maybe there's some sense in which a stimulus package or a universal basic income type measure sort of smooths out the effects, where it doesn't create such a shock to such a large number of people. It sort of lets them cope a little bit better with that, and it reduces maybe the differential effect on wage workers. So the benefits could be that it mitigates the costs associated with number one and number four. Potentially, it makes, you know, the transition between jobs easier as well, and maybe it actually lubricates the economy a little bit by giving people a little bit more time to think about where they're going to work next or where their talents are best employed. It's not going to do much for the cultural stuff, or for the people that are losing wealth. but it could mitigate some of the inequality and have an effect on some of the short run unemployment. So I would say that those would be the benefits of some sort of mitigation or relief package. And then the costs. The cost of that. So the costs of something like that are going to either that money has to come from taxes in the current period, or it's got to come from future taxes. So any money the government borrows, they're going to have to pay interest to the bondholders. Eventually, those are going to come due, and they'll have to either do some combination of future spending cuts or future tax increases. So either future taxpayers or beneficiaries of government programs in the future, which are going to have to be cut. So future members of society are going to have to see either their taxes go up or their government benefits go down, and so it's sort of transferring the burden a little bit from people today to people in the future. Some of them are still going to be alive and be feeling the effects of that, but it could have longer run effects on the size of the government budget and maybe the drag that starts to have on the economy if it forces future tax increases that have a disincentive effect on work, or a distortionary effect on prices in some way that sort of produces future deadweight losses as a result of those higher tax increases. So off the top of my head, that's how I would probably frame the issue of these mitigation and relief measures that would be there to sort of ease the transition or ease the burden on some of especially the people that are losing their jobs right now. Does that help? Does that answer your question? Okay, great. Okay, so the last thing, we have a few more minutes. I wanted to think about, so we've started this discussion with this curve here. I want to focus right now on the benefits of containment. So the measures we take now to reduce the contact that people are having with one another, to reduce the transmissibility of the infectious disease, those measures will have benefits. And let me try to just frame how to think about those by using I'm using a framework actually from the USDA Economic Research Service, which has some calculations for cost of illness associated with different sort of foodborne illnesses. So what I'm doing here is I'm kind of borrowing some of the existing frameworks that governments currently use for evaluating the cost of illness, and just using that as maybe a starting point to think about what are the benefits of containing this disease. So this is actually, this table here corresponds to costs of illness from the norovirus. This is an illness that can, or a virus that can spread to people as a result of contaminated food or water. And then, of course, once someone contracts it, then they can spread it interpersonally. But I got these data from the Economic Research Service arm of the USDA, which has some estimates of the cost of different foodborne illnesses, and they use those to try to set guidelines for food safety regulations. So I think we can use these as sort of a framework for thinking about what the benefits of containment. So in this table, let me just try to explain different aspects of this table. We have, this is actually for the year 2013. This is 2013 data. But right here in this bold number up in the top left, this is the total number of cases of norovirus in the United States in 2013. And then they break down the the number of cases in terms of those who were not hospitalized, those who were hospitalized. So that represents the full set of individuals affected. They further break down the non-hospitalized individuals between those who didn't visit a physician and recovered. So that's there's this first category is didn't visit a physician and recovered. The second category is visited a physician and recovered. And there are various costs associated with those two categories of people. So for people that visited a physician and recovered, they're going to lose productivity. They're going to lose some days of work. They're going to be sick in bed perhaps and not be able to go to work, and so they're not going to be able to earn the economy in general is going to lose out on the productivity that those people are going to forego by being in bed rather than being at work. And then furthermore, for those who actually visited a physician, there's costs associated with physician office visits and visits to the emergency room, outpatient visits. And so there's total bills that are associated with that. The hospital is spending resources to deal with those people that contract norovirus, and so those estimates are here in this second column. And then for those who are actually hospitalized, that there's a much smaller subset of people. Let's see, it's about less. I mean, it's less than 1% of people are hospitalized. But for those who are hospitalized, the bill associated with that is pretty high. So there's a lot of costs associated with hospitalizations, keeping people in the hospital overnight, using the medical equipment that they need to recover. Those bills are pretty expensive. And then some subset of those people are going to have costs associated with recovering after they come out of the hospital. So some of them are going to go into the hospital and actually pass away. And in that case, the costs of their premature death are sort of computed right here in terms of the number of lives lost, and then the multiplication of that by the value of a statistical life. But even for those who are recovering, maybe who exit the hospital, but they still have to spend some time in rehab or recovery, and there's going to be costs associated with them recovering. And so overall, you can think about those costs as entailing, an amount that the ERS calculated as being roughly $2.2 billion, being the cost of illness from norovirus. So these are the kinds of benefits to containment that you might want to be thinking about. It would be the changes in these numbers from the baseline. These numbers would have some baseline amount of value for physician visits and hospitalizations and deaths, and then you'd compute what those new costs would be under a regime of strict containment, and the difference there, the reduced costs in illness, would be how to think about the benefits to a containment policy. There's some diseases, not in the case of norovirus, but there's some that have chronic implications. So there might be some people that become chronically ill and have to live with symptoms or with some kind of pain for the rest of their life. Maybe there's some loss of neurological function that they sustain as a result of the sickness, and so they'll have sustained illness. But that would also be part of the cost of illness if there were those effects present. But these are kind of the way to think about the benefits of containment from our graph up here on the fifth slide. These benefits of containment, those are going to be the reductions in those costs of illness that result from the containment policy. Okay, so we're at time right now. Are there any questions about anything that I went over today that you want to ask right now before we sign off? I know it's harder to do that over Zoom, and I wish there was a way to mitigate some of this, the downsides of this new format. But is there any last questions before we sign off for the day? Ray does not have any extra questions. So I'll be in touch. I'm gonna, by this afternoon, I want to have that new homework assignment created and posted. That'll be due roughly a week from today. I think Friday is when I'll make that due. And I'll pick up with this again on Tuesday. Just maybe reviewing some of these concepts again. I'll post another discussion board thing for in this case. I think I'm going to post a discussion regarding the uncertainties around the virus and the virus spread and the severity of the virus, all the uncertainties associated with that. So that'll be part of the next discussion, and of course all that material you can then use toward the homework assignment that I'm creating, which is just going to be some kind of summary of this benefit cost framework applied to our current situation dealing with this COVID-19 public health matter. So look for that this afternoon. Thanks again for the posts you made on the last discussion board. That was really excellent what you guys did. I'll stick around just for a few more minutes, just in case anyone has any questions. But you can consider this the end of class for today. Yeah, I'm looking at that. Okay, so the to your question, Sienna, about the due date. So the third writing assignment, the syllabus has that on April 7th, Tuesday. I'm probably going to move that to Thursday or Friday, April 9th or 10th. Just because we're roughly, I've been bumping things back roughly one class period. So the writing assignment 3 is not going to be due until at the earliest April 9th, but I might make it Friday, April 10th. Good. Yeah. So that's yeah. Those will be about a week apart. You'll have about a week to do the third homework assignment, which again, I don't want it to be a massive extra burden with tons of extra research. But I'm sure you guys are all reading a lot about the virus itself as you're following the news and just keeping up with current events. And so this is a way for you to channel some of that into something productive that relates to what we've been learning about in this course. So I'm hoping that that's not too much of an extra burden. Really, the main idea is just to get practice applying some of these concepts we've been talking about to a very relevant contemporary topic. Yeah. So that'll be about a week from now, a week and a day, I guess. Friday, April 3rd for homework 3. And then probably Friday, April 10th is when the third writing assignment will be due.